welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 83. I'm Steve Kwan.
I'm Matt Kwan.
BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. So, Matt, how hot are you right now?
So just so everyone knows, I'm sweating my bag off in my apartment, and for the sake of having better audio quality, I'm not setting myself up with a fan.
So this is awesome because on my side, I've got a noise-canceling mic, and it's like, I don't want to say it's cool, but I don't feel like I'm going to die sitting where I am right now. But Matt is like stuffed into a closet with a $40 blue snowball mic to get decent audio quality for all of the listeners and all of the patrons. So I don't want to hear any shit from people about how we don't sacrifice and we don't bleed for you guys. Like, there's a lot of good free value coming out for you. And, you know, it's not just a matter of recording. There's legitimate pain and suffering related to making this podcast sometimes.
I'm in the sweat box. It's miserable. But I'm here to record. Let's talk about some jiu-jitsu or whatever what are we talking about today anyways?
Oh, who knows? Yeah, for those who don't know, we live in Port Coquitlam, BC, Canada, and it's 30 degrees Celsius, I think, today. The summer is really kicking off. I don't know what that comes into in terms of Fahrenheit, but it's hot.
Yeah, it's actually pretty awesome. We got some good rivers and outdoor places to see, so we're pretty lucky here. We're actually quite spoiled.
I do get a kick out of how there's this river out back near where we live, and there's always these rednecks sitting out there partying at like every single day. I mean, today when we're recording, it's a Monday. And I walked down for lunch and I saw all of these people out there partying. And I was thinking, what are you people doing with your life where you can go and just have random beach parties on a Monday afternoon?
Dude, it's COVID time. These people don't have jobs. They don't work.
Well, clearly they need to get into the podcast industry. Oh, so we were talking about this. My wife and kid are out of town, so I've basically regressed to just being an idiot bachelor again, and I finally completed Final Fantasy VII Remake. Now, what I really want to talk about today, I want to do like a full 1.5 hour in-depth discussion of that game, but I think probably we'll lose like 95% of our listeners. But Matt, you would agree it's awesome, right?
It's awesome. Here's my criticism of the game. I have two criticisms.
No spoilers.
No, I'm not going to spoil anything.
Okay.
Number one, it's way too easy.
It's quite easy.
Even on the most difficult setting, I found it easy. Even though I loved the interactive fighting system and everything, and the graphics and the environment is incredible. But it's far too easy, aside from a few bosses, which are pretty easily solved if you just use your brain. And then the other criticism is there's many parts of the game where it basically just funnels you exactly where you need to go. And I guess a third criticism is the problem solving is really easy. So if any criticism is there, it's just that it was too easy. But goddamn, Tifa's hot.
Yeah, I did kind of feel, and we'll get to Tifa in a second, I did kind of feel like you're getting funneled down a hallway, like the entire game.
The entire game.
And it's an incredible hallway. Like, it really is immersive, that game. The world they've created is awesome. And the soundtrack is easily the greatest soundtrack ever made for anything. It's amazing.
So nostalgic. It's so awesome.
But that said, it's a pretty easy game, and there's not a lot of exploration that you can do. It's a lot of narrow corridors, and I know that in the original game, it kind of starts off that way, and then later on, it kind of opens up. But yeah, there's not a lot of wide exploration that you can do. It's very linear. But that said, though, if you have any nostalgia for the original, I definitely recommend it. It's also kind of like a fun thing to do during like COVID time if you're looking for something to take your mind off of the world. It's a good experience. Interestingly, I moved on now to playing The Last of Us, and that is the worst.
Number two.
And that is the worst thing you could possibly play during a global pandemic because it's a super depressing game. It is about a global pandemic, and it's just everything in the game is absolutely miserable. So I'm like 2 hours into that, and I am not loving it so far.
Yeah, I just don't like in Final Fantasy VII how there's that scene where you essentially get raped. You get pass out, and then who knows what is it Cornelio? Cornholio? Don Cornholio's henchmen like literally have their way with you. It's weird. You wake up and you're like, it's very suggestive. I'm not exaggerating at all.
So we've probably lost like 95% of our audience at this point. But let's continue that thought. So for those of you who have no idea what Matt's talking about, the original Final Fantasy VII, I want to say came out in like the late 90s. And it was the first one of those games that like actual normal people played, because before that it was just total nerds who would play that game. And that was the one that kind of broke through a little bit into the mainstream. And there is a part of the game where you have to like infiltrate this mafia boss's headquarters. And the only way to do that is he's got a soft spot for the ladies. So they decide brilliantly that they need to dress up your male character as a sexy lady to sneak him in. And if you do it right, like if you do it really right and you get like all of the right bonuses and everything and you do it just the right way, your reward is you get raped by his henchmen. Like it's and I'm not exaggerating, you can Google this. That happens in the original game. Now they softened it in the remake for obvious reasons, but still it's really fucked up. And it's one of those things where I don't know about you, Matt, but when I was a kid and I saw that, like, it didn't really register. And maybe it's just because I was so young. I just thought it was this stupid thing. But looking back at it now, I can't believe they put that into a video game. Like, it's really fucked up that made it into a video game that released to that many millions of people.
Well, let's be honest. Like, throughout most Japanese games, there's tons of suggestive shit. There's girls who are walking around in skimpy clothes and, you know, have really busty figures. And even there's times when there's like seemingly underage characters that are made out to look really attractive. It's kind of creepy, to be honest. And I don't know. It's very suggestive.
That's an aesthetic in Japanese games that honestly I find really
awesome. I mean, horrible.
I find it really distracting because it is really, really hard to take a game seriously when that shit's going on. But yeah, no, to your point, I mean, Tifa is a great example because like you're supposed to believe that this woman is like this incredible killer martial artist, which is bizarre because she's supposed to be like 20 years old and she's a bartender. But you're also supposed to believe that she's like basically like Chuck Norris, that, you know, she's just this incredible martial artist. But does she dress like a martial artist or a fighter? No, she wears like basically a skin tight tank top and a mini skirt, and it's just absolutely preposterous. Yeah, it's
and the whole game, preposterous. The whole game, she keeps saying, "God, I need a shower." the entire game.
That's one of those unfortunate things about the game, which is like after a battle, there's stock audio clips that play, you know, like a kind of like to close it out, I guess. But one of Tifa's is she says something like, "I need a shower," but I'm telling you, she says that like every 5 minutes, and it gets really weird after a while.
It is weird, but it's a good game. I was also a little bit disappointed that they basically took the game and then they only did the first part. So we've waited all this time for a remake when they didn't really give you the second half, or maybe even there's more than the second half. Maybe they're going to make it a 3-parter. So by the time I'm 60, I'll be able to finish the game.
I think I saw that they're going to do a trilogy. So you are going to be waiting for a while.
Do you think they've even started? They must have like the groundwork done for the second and the third.
You would assume so. I really hope it's not another 5-year wait. I hope that it's a year or two. I mean, maybe that's just wishful thinking, but I really want to continue off on this game before I forget about it. But yeah, it was otherwise absolutely awesome and has absolutely nothing to do with this podcast except that it's great. So if you're into that, then go do it.
So we're 10 minutes in now. Sorry,
is this
everyone.
A record? Is this a record of wasted time?
Oh boy. What an embarrassment.
Yeah. Well, you know, if this has been compelling to you for some reason, I can't even imagine why it would be. But anyway, yeah. So Final Fantasy VII Remake, thumbs up, give it a go. This is a jiu-jitsu podcast, right? I guess we should probably talk about something kind of relevant.
Yeah, shoot.
Okay, cool. Well, we had a bunch of ideas that we wanted to talk about, but something that came up recently, actually, when I was talking to Rory on the podcast about online education, was the fear of taking the first step. Basically, how whenever you want to do anything meaningful or important, it's hard for a variety of reasons. It is psychologically very challenging to actually take that first step on a new journey. And both Rory and I had talked about how when we wanted to start, in his case, a YouTube channel, in our case, a podcast, it's kind of intimidating at first because You're basically putting your opinion out there to the world, to who knows how many people, and you're really opening yourself up to a lot of criticism. And of course, the challenge to doing anything new is at the time you start, you don't really have a track record or any real reason why people should take you seriously. So, it reminds me of that old like Adam Sandler, Chris Farley skit where they're talking about how they're all going to laugh at you. You kind of worry when you're going to do a new initiative like that. Am I just going to get humiliated by doing this? So realistically, probably a lot of the things that people should do for their own personal growth, they never really do. And that first step never really gets taken. And the irony is, Matt, and you know this as well as I do, once you actually give it a shot and you try that super scary thing, usually it turns out not to be as scary as you thought. And usually the worst case scenario is actually like, it's not as bad as you thought it would be. But it's a really, really critical psychological hangup. And it definitely is commonplace in jiu-jitsu. I mean, first and foremost, we've all been through the struggle of the intimidation factor of showing up for your first class. I mean, I remember when I decided that I wanted to do a martial art and I'd settled on jiu-jitsu. And honestly, that's even something that I really dragged my feet on, right? I probably should have started 5 years before I did, but I just kind of put it off. And part of that is because it's kind of a scary thing. And that first class is super intimidating, but once you get past it, we all know it's not that bad. But it continues on, right? I mean, if you go into a competition, you're going to get that competition jitters for the first time. If you teach a class for the first time, I mean, that can be a pretty harrowing experience the first time you have to actually teach. And of course, when you get to black belt or brown belt or wherever, and you decide that it's time to go off on your own and you want to open your own business, you want to open your own gym, I mean, then you have to deal with that fear again. So the thing about that path to success is it's a constant struggle of having to overcome that fear of taking the first step on a new journey. And that's something that I mean, Matt, I know you've got thoughts on, so why don't you go ahead and riff on this?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is what you're describing as milestones, and throughout life, there's so many milestones, and I can think of so many that I've gone through, I mean, my first jiu-jitsu class, my first jiu-jitsu competition, when you get a new belt and now you're competing at a different level, you're wondering how you're going to fare against people of the same rank. I've done cooking competitions in my previous career, and those are nerve-wracking,
like Iron Chef?
It wasn't like black box like Iron Chef, although I have done a few like that, but I've done a few different rules. It's usually like you got to make a first, second, third course. One of them was black box, meaning you don't know the ingredients inside. Maybe you have to make 3 dishes within a certain time frame, and then one main ingredient for each dish, but you don't know what else is in the black box. And then there's competitions I've done where it's like you have to design your dishes ahead of time, and then you come in and you have to use what they give you. So it is nerve-wracking. It's difficult, and it sucks when you lose. I've won some competitions and I've lost some competitions, and in the end, I just I realized I'm like, this kind of sucks. Like even if I win, awesome, but if I lose, then I didn't really gain anything. I learned how to be a better cook, and I learned about time management, and I learned about stress, but kind of sucks. Like in jiu-jitsu, at least when you train for a competition, you put in the work, you get into a better level of fitness, and I'm more passionate about jiu-jitsu than I was about cooking.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you start one of these competitions, is there an Asian man who takes a bite out of an apple and then turns and smiles coyly at you?
No, but he was there with me in spirit.
Amazing.
But yeah, it's so, and then another good one is, getting your driver's license, going in. In Canada here, we have the L test and the N test, which are basically like beginner and intermediate levels for your driver's license. Like all of these things are nerve wracking. I can remember the first time I drove a standard. My last car was a standard. And if you've ever driven a standard and you don't know how yet, man, it sucks, because you go out and drive and you're just hoping you don't fuck up, basically. And if you have to stop on a hill and you have to start on that hill, it can be really crazy, especially if someone's behind you. So, these are all nerve-wracking moments. And to your point, I think the best way to approach these challenges, at least what I've done, is it's a mental battle, and then you just realize you got to fucking do it. If you avoid these challenges and you just never test yourself, then Like they say, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So a big part of it is developing the courage to be able to actually go through with these milestones in life.
It's funny you mention that, because a lot of people really obsess over this and they ask themselves, well, what is the trick? What is the trick to doing these big things? And I think really, at least from my experience, the answer is at some point you just say, fuck it. And you just do it.
Yeah, totally.
There is no big trick. There is no psychological process of, how you prepare yourself. It's just at some point you just get frustrated that it's not being done and you do it. And that's kind of how you overcome that hump. I don't think there's a big psychology around it. And I actually kind of wonder if the more you think about taking that first step into something new, the more you're going to fuck yourself, because you're going to basically psych yourself out of actually doing it. And I kind of feel like sometimes, if you're humming and hawing over whether you want to take that first step, it's better to not get caught up in your own thoughts and just go ahead and do it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the end of the day, it's, at least what I've found is, it's just a mental battle, and a lot of the time it's your own fear and your own self-doubt and anxiety that really plays a factor. And once you start doing something, it's really not that scary. Like even in a jiu-jitsu competition, for me, the most nerve-wracking part is like driving to the venue and then waiting all day until your name is called. Once I'm actually on the mat, I feel pretty much comfortable, even if in high stress situations. At least it's really a familiar feeling for me, because I'm training hours and hours a day. So it's the waiting around and the warming up and the anticipation that I'm not used to, and driving to a venue that you never go to, and maybe you're in a different city. Like these are all unfamiliar things. But once I actually step onto the mat and I get to my position that I like, I actually, oddly enough, feel pretty comfortable. So a lot of it has to do with mindset and how you mentally prepare yourself for something challenging like that. But life is full of things that are nerve-wracking and things that will test your courage. And if you don't just say fuck it and just do it, and if you succeed, you succeed. If you fail, you fail. If you don't do that, then you're not going to gain anything. So I think it's better to have tried and failed than to not try at all.
I fully understand what you're saying there. And I think that when people get into these situations where they're kind of obsessing over, should I go forward with this? Should I not? The thing that you need to do to move forward is you need to learn to kind of bring your mind back into the present moment, because the more you're worrying about like what's going to happen 2 days from now, 3 days from now, even a few minutes, a few hours from now, the more that you're focused on this thing you're afraid of that's coming up, the more you're preventing yourself from actually preparing in the moment. So that's kind of the challenge, is that the more you actually think about something and the more you worry about it, the more you're going to put yourself in a situation where you hesitate to actually do it. And sometimes you need to actually just pull the trigger and do something. Now, this gets a little bit tricky, because that's not to say that you want to just do things with abandon without considering the risks, right? There's a lot of things that you don't want to do because they're stupid things to do. And you've got to really think about whether there's a good reason to do something. You've got to do an analysis in your head in terms of like, okay, what could actually go wrong if I do this? But a lot of the things that we're talking about here, like showing up for your first jiu-jitsu class, these are pretty low risk things, right? Really, the benefit is going to dramatically outweigh any downside that comes out of it. There are other stupid things that you could do, like getting into a bar fight, for example, might be one of those stupid things where there's a lot more to lose than there is to gain. But for the kinds of things we're talking about here today, like when you identify those situations where, it's basically just more upside than downside, then continuing to obsess over it and all of the things that could go wrong, like there's a point where planning too much actually starts to psych you out and causes you to hesitate in such a way that you might never actually be able to bring yourself to take that first step. So when I hear people who talk about how like, I just want to do this, but I'm afraid, or I just want to do this, but I'm waiting for the right time. The challenge there is the more you analyze what's going to happen in the future, the more you give yourself reasons not to do those things. And you can wind up actually talking yourself out of those things. And of course, most people, they're not going to admit it's because they're afraid, but that's a big part of it, right? Is, they're coming up with reasons not to do something because there's a fear of loss, there's a fear of humiliation, there's a fear of something going terribly wrong. And so there is that point where going beyond and doing excessive mental preparation can actually be a detriment to you.
Yeah, like when you're saying stuff like, oh, will I ever be ready? One of the things that comes to my mind is having children or getting married. Like these are huge marital milestones that, so many of us go through. And I remember before I was married, I was with my wife, she wanted to get married and I was like, oh, I don't know if we're ready or whatever. And then of course we got married and then she wanted to have a kid and I'm like, I don't know if I'm ready. And the truth is that if you think like that, then you're really never going to be ready. And you're totally right about second guessing yourself and doubting yourself when really sometimes you just got to go and do it. And one of my biggest fears about procrastinating and second guessing yourself is that it becomes a habit and that you start to approach problems and possible accomplishments in your life and different milestones with that mindset of, can I actually do this? Or am I able to do this? Is this something that is possible? Because if you really start second guessing, that could easily become a habit. Now I've realized that going into something, as stressful as a competition or, going to a class or having a child, all these big things, if you have that mindset of self-doubt and not having that confidence to just try, then, you're going to be holding yourself back. So at some point, you just kind of, what's the saying, bite the bullet and just move forward. And if you fail, that's a great way to learn and make adjustments. If you succeed, awesome.
Well, that's a really important thing to clarify, which is that a lot of the time when people don't want to do something, when they create a bunch of reasons as to why, oh, I can't do this or I don't want to do this, a lot of the time is because they're afraid of failure. But that's a mindset where you're looking at failure as losing. And I mean, I know that sounds kind of weird, but we've talked about this before in the podcast about how failure is sometimes a good thing because when you fail, it's a learning opportunity. If you look at failure as taking away something from you, or some sort of public humiliation, then of course you're going to think negatively about it. But if you look at failure as a learning opportunity that's going to help you succeed more next time, then you realize pretty quickly there's nothing to be ashamed of in terms of failure. And in fact, it's something that you should not avoid, but you should actively move towards. You should go to opportunities where you have the possibility of failing. Because if you're only doing things where there's no risk of failure, then by definition, you're playing it safe. And that means you're just not going to grow. You're denying yourself growth opportunities. So for me, that's something that you always want to kind of be self-critical of, is looking at your life and asking yourself, am I playing it too safe? Am I living in such a way that I'm trying to avoid any kind of failure, any kind of loss? Because if that's the situation you've put yourself in, I mean, yes, you are maybe minimizing your losses, but you're also denying yourself possible gains and growth opportunities.
Yeah. It's funny, like we're talking about things that we can control. So, you do a jiu-jitsu competition, you can control your preparation and your diet and your game plan, your strategy. You go in there, you compete, you win or you lose, whatever. These are things that we can control for the most part. We have the ability to influence the outcome of the situation. However, there's also going to be times in life where things are not going to be within your control. So for example, like I got a knee surgery about a year ago and I was worried about it and didn't know what the result was going to be like. Really, they do an MRI on your knee, but they can tell you sort of what's going on with your meniscus, but they actually can't tell you exactly where it's broken or whatever until they go in there. Some people go in with like a damaged ACL and, you have to make a decision when that doctor goes in to scope out your meniscus, if that's something they need to do. If you feel like your ACL is also, if it needs work, then you have to either consent or not consent for the surgeon to replace the ACL. And they only know what the damage on the ACL is once they really go in there. Like the MRI, it actually doesn't tell you everything. So you kind of have to make this decision, like, is my ACL bad enough where it needs a full replacement? And if it is, then that's going to mean, maybe a year off. Whereas if you just agree to the meniscus cleaning, that's essentially like a month off, realistically, and then you can get right back to training. So you got to make this decision And none of it is in your control, really. Maybe the surgeon fucks up, or maybe the surgeon's awesome. I don't know. It's just one of those things that you kind of have to hope, goes for the better. Another example of making a big decision that's kind of scary, where you don't really have any control, would be like, for example, getting a tattoo. Like I've got 2 small tattoos. And I'm not going to lie, that was nerve-wracking. Like leading up to it, it's going to be painful. You're not quite sure how much pain it's going to be. You don't know what it's going to look like when it's done. These are all kind of stressful things, and none of them are really within your control. The only control you really have is the artist you select. Hopefully you catch them on a good day, and hopefully they're on that day. And also, how are you going to cope with the pain? Personally, for me, when I got my tattoo, I instantly started sweating bullets in the chair. Just sweating uncontrollably. A lot of it was terror sweat, but it's the stress of it all, and you have no idea how it's going to turn out. On a smaller scale, I guess it could be like getting a haircut. Personally, I hate getting a haircut because I'm worried that they're going to screw it up. So these are all things.
Really?
Yeah. I'm kind of OCD about that.
You hate getting a haircut. I mean, I guess I can't really relate because I haven't really...
You shave your head.
I haven't had anyone else cut my hair in like 10 or 15 years, so I guess it's just something I can't really relate to.
Yeah. No, I used to shave my head, but then you started doing it, so I stopped.
Of course.
Because I don't want to look like you. No, I'm just kidding. Of course. You're very good looking, man.
Thank you.
But yeah, some things you're just not going to be in control of. But, if you don't put yourself in those situations, you can't achieve those things. So sometimes you just got to throw caution into the wind and do and do it.
I think for some people, the fact that in some situations they can control the outcome makes it even scarier for them. Because, if something happens to you, and you have really no ability to control it, and you just have to move on with your life, then at least you can tell yourself, well, I had nothing to do with this. There's nothing I could have done. But if it's a situation where you actually can control the outcome and it doesn't go your way, then you have to own that. And I mean, we've talked about how on the podcast, that's a good thing. But for some people, they're not going to interpret that as a good thing, right? They're going to avoid those situations because it's going to reflect poorly on them. I mean, I'm reminded of when you duck the hard roll in the gym, right? There's the guy that is going to kick your ass. So you avoid rolling with him because you don't want to have everyone see you get your ass kicked in front of everybody. And although that's understandable, you're actually shying away from the growth opportunities that you need to improve, because you just roll with the guys that you're going to tune every single time. I mean, your ability to improve from that hits a ceiling pretty quickly. So I think for some people, it might actually be scary when they do have agency in the outcome, because when it doesn't go their way, they've got to own up to that and accept that, like, look, I have to own this. I could have done this, but I failed to do it. And if the ego's involved, that can be a very painful thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, when they go into something like a competition, I think we've discussed this before in previous episodes, where they basically create excuses for themselves even before the competition, because for whatever reason, they actually don't think that they can win, or they're trying to soften the blow of failure, that if they go and try to achieve this goal and then they come up short, they can say, oh well I didn't really, I'm just a recreational guy trying a competition. I don't really care if I win. It's like, well, why are you investing time and money doing something like that anyways? Like, it's great to get experience and just try something. But personally, for me, I have the mindset where if I try to do something, I try and apply myself 100%. Otherwise, I just won't try something. Imagine you start a business and then your mindset is like, oh, well, I'm just going to try this. I'm not even going to really, if I fail, I fail. It's like, it's not really an option to do that, because then you got to go back to your previous life, and then you've lost a ton of resources trying to start something up. So it's not a smart way to think.
Well, I think there is a situation where it makes sense not to go 100% on something. I mean, the example I would give is, as we've established earlier in this podcast, I like playing video games. Now, there are competitive gamers out there who make millions of dollars doing competitive video gaming as a full-time hobby. I have no interest in doing that. I mean, I don't even play online multiplayer because I have so little time to play these things that I suck at it. When I play a video game, I just want to waste some time and take my mind off of things. So in a situation like that, I think it makes sense if you're honest with yourself about, hey, this is what I want out of this, and this is the amount of effort I'm willing to put into it. I think that that's one thing. But yeah, if you're going to go into something, trying to talk yourself out of success is a weird habit. It's a defensive mechanism that I think people deploy so that when they do lose, they can kind of make it look like that was the plan all along, even if it wasn't.
Yeah, I know a few people that do that, and they kind of suck. Not gonna lie. Like, they're just not really excellent at what they do. So if that's the mindset that you have, then it's not really, you get what you put in. You're just never going to compare to someone who wants something so bad that they will die for that, and those people exist, especially when you're talking about jiu-jitsu at the highest level or business at the highest level. It's just, if you don't want something that bad and you're not willing to sacrifice and put the time in, then unfortunately you're not going to get anywhere with that. So I think a lot of it just comes down to mindset. Now, this being said, Steve, let's get you in a competition. Come on.
Not going to happen.
For the people listening, don't you guys think Steve should do one competition? Come on.
Maybe we should set a goal. Like, if we get up to like 5,000 patrons.
Just an unrealistic number.
Although with my luck, that would actually happen, though. No, I mean, for me, it's the same example I gave with video games, right? It's just, for me, jiu-jitsu has always been a fun hobby. It's never really been something I took super duper seriously. I like it as a way to get exercise and to ultimately get some, learn some degree of self-defense. But I remember, it's funny you mentioned this, because I remember, of course, when I was a white belt, there's almost like a pressure campaign for anyone who does jiu-jitsu. They're like, oh, if you're doing jiu-jitsu, you must want to do a competition. And this is one of the interesting things I find about jiu-jitsu, which is that it seems like everyone just kind of assumes that, well, if you're training jiu-jitsu, the goal must be that you want to compete at some point. And a lot of hobbies and even casual sports don't seem to have that kind of mindset. And I wonder if it stems from the fact that so many of these gyms are created by competitors. So that is their worldview. But it's just something that's never really honestly appealed to me. I mean, sure, you could argue that maybe I'm just afraid of taking that first step. I mean, I definitely was when I was a white belt and people told me, oh, you should consider competing. But I look at it now, pushing 40, I've got all of these things that I want to do in my life that take up so much of my time, and I can only divide my attention in so many ways. And every hour that I spend on jiu-jitsu is a distraction from those other things that I've prioritized above. So at some point you kind of have to time box things, right? You have to say, like, look, the maximum amount of time I'm willing to spend on this or that is so many hours, because it's just going to start at some point stopping being fun and taking away from the things that I've prioritized higher. So it gets to be a really, really difficult conversation with yourself. And I don't know if there is really a right answer. I mean, I think we've talked about this in the past where, I mean, if you were to ask me to tell you that it is 100% true that I don't want to compete, I'm not even sure I could answer that, right? Because it is totally possible that actually I'm just subconsciously afraid of it. That's one of those things that is very hard to answer, is because sometimes those subconscious fears, you don't even realize they're happening. But I do have to admit, I would much rather play Final Fantasy VII Remake than compete.
Yeah, I mean, the first few competitions I did, I don't even know if I would say they were enjoyable, really, even though I got double gold in my first tournament, but it was only awesome because I won. Like, the whole process of leading up was not enjoyable. And you kind of have to, I mean, I guess you kind of got to be a glutton for punishment, really. And like I said, what we described earlier about going into something just to try it and just to have fun. It's like, well, you don't really care if you win or lose then. So for me, I wouldn't do a competition unless I really wanted to win.
Yeah, that's a weird mentality, because even if you don't want to be like a total world beater, if at some point you've made the decision that, okay, I'm going to at least try this, then you should at least try to win. It is not good to start rallying your excuses before you've even tried. I mean, I'm trying to think of like what that would look like in another walk of life. Like, imagine that you there's a job that you want, and you go to the interview and they ask you why you applied here, and you say, well, I just, I'm just here for the fun. I don't really think I'm like good enough to actually do this job. But, I thought, well, I might as well throw my hat in the ring and see what happens. But yeah, I'm not expecting to get this job.
I'm just seeing if I can get it. I don't actually think I can do the job.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing. And I think that, again, one of the things that's fascinating about jiu-jitsu is so many weird psychological tendencies we have are just totally laid bare, right? Because everything is so immediate. The feedback is very immediate. It's very direct, right? Like you're literally sparring with somebody. It can't get much more direct than that. And when you're out in the real world, you often don't get that kind of direct feedback, and you're not really put in a situation where you have to confront your inner fears that often, right? I mean, you can go decades without ever having to really have like an existential moment with yourself. Whereas in jiu-jitsu, it happens quite frequently. And I think that's one of the reasons why it is such a useful tool for personal development, is because it really forces you to be introspective. It puts you in bad positions, both physically and emotionally sometimes. And you have to learn to roll with that, right? And it's one thing to like say, hey, I'm bad at jiu-jitsu. I mean, we've talked about this in the past about how like, some people say, oh, I'm bad at jiu-jitsu. And I mean, if we're going to be completely honest, not everyone is great at jiu-jitsu, and not everyone necessarily will become great at jiu-jitsu. But the thing is, it's okay to be bad, because being bad is a stepping stone to getting better. Like if you're not willing to be honest and open with yourself about the fact that, hey, I have room to improve, and you're not willing to take the actions to make that improvement, then you won't improve, right? And I feel like when people say things like, oh, I'm not very good at jiu-jitsu, or, oh, I don't think I'm going to win this tournament, I just figured I'd give it a go. Like they're kind of hedging their losses emotionally so that they can avoid having to really make the commitment to get better the next time around, right? And I think it's actually much better to just go in and just own it and just say like, yeah, yes, I won. Yes, I lost. Here's why. Here's the situation. Here's how I become better. I think if you kind of go in with that baked in layer of excuses, then it makes it a lot easier to deny yourself the opportunity to improve after the fact.
Yeah, let's for a second remove the example of competition and think about someone taking that I don't really care attitude into just the practice room. It's like that would be as an instructor, that would be the most irritating thing ever, to have people on the mats that are like, I don't really care if I get better. I'm just sort of here just to take up mat space and to say that I do a martial art or whatever. It's like, well, if you're here and you're putting in the time, if you don't work hard and you don't do your best to improve, you're now a liability. Now you're actually making the training environment shittier. So why would you bring that attitude to the school? Like I only want people at my school who actually want to get better. And I'm not afraid to say that. Like I don't want people who don't care about it. I don't want people that are like, oh, I don't really, that's like someone coming in and I show them a technique and they're like, I don't really care about that technique, or that's not going to work for me. Or, they just basically disregard it. When you go into the gym or whatever, like you should have that attitude. At least, you're going to try your best, even if you're not good. At least if you try to be good, then I can totally forgive the fact that you're not good, is because it's all about attitude, right? But you have that attitude like, I don't really care, or you're relaxed and you slack and you start weighing people down, and you become less than just not good. You become actually negative because you influence other people in the room negatively.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I mean, I've worked with people like that who clearly just don't want to be there. And it's not a decision that impacts just themselves. It impacts everyone around them. It drags everyone down. It starts to impact the culture. It's actually called emotional contagion. It's where the emotions that you bring to the table are contagious and they can affect the people around you. And it's why if you're ever leading a team, it's so important to deal with that head on if someone is expressing those tendencies, because yeah, it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation if you pull someone aside and talk to them about their negativity or how like they clearly don't care. It's going to be awkward, and you might feel like the easier thing to do is just to ignore it and do nothing. But the problem is, if you do that, that mentality is going to spread.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it doesn't spread, at the bare minimum, it's going to start impacting the other people in the room to the point where kind of the morale of the whole team is going to go down and everyone's going to slow down with them. I mean, it only takes one toxic person to ruin a team. So that is something to bear in mind, is that, you know, if you're kind of baking in all of these excuses about how you don't want to get better, it isn't always just you that gets impacted by that. It actually can impact the people around you as well, because, I mean, human beings are social animals, right? We look to others for behavioral cues. And if you're setting the message that your endeavor is something that is not worth caring about, other people will pick up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, step into the arena. Come on, do it for me.
Like in Final Fantasy, because I already cleared the Colosseum.
Did you actually? Because I didn't do that.
So I cleared the first Colosseum, and then after you beat the game, it like opens up a whole bunch more advanced Colosseum stuff. And I thought, fuck it, I'm just going to go play The Last of Us. So I did.
Yeah. But really, come on. Step
it
into
just
the
doesn't
arena.
appeal to me. I mean, when I was younger, I mean, I kind of sort of thought about it, but a lot of the reason why I think a lot of people get kind of pushed in that direction is because that is one of the interesting things about jiu-jitsu, is there is like a funnel into getting students into competition. I think competition is given an outsized weight in jiu-jitsu. I mean, as a gym owner, you know, like the majority of the students that float your gym are not super competitive grapplers. A lot of them are just there to learn. But the one thing about jiu-jitsu is we do really put an outsized emphasis on the importance of competition. And I gotta say, like, at this point in my life, it just isn't something that really appeals to me. And even when I first started, I mean, I kind of felt like it was something that you had to do because everyone in the gym said, well, if you're training, surely you have to compete. And people thought it was really baffling that I wasn't interested in it, but I'm just not. It just really never has been something that appeals to me personally. I mean, I look at the ROI for it for myself, and it's just, I kind of have a box around how much time I'm willing to spend on any particular activity like that. It's not the thing I want to do with my life, is to devote all of that time and energy into competing. And I don't begrudge anyone who does want to do that. But for me, I mean, I've got so many other things that I need to accomplish that I've got to be honest with the limitations of my time. And that time for me, I made the decision to spend it elsewhere. So probably I'll never compete, especially now that I'm old and fat and fragile. I feel like it's probably even a worse idea at this point than it would have been when I was younger.
That's what Masters is for, man. If you're a listener, send Steve your hate mail and let's get him to compete.
I already get enough of that. Maybe I'll wait until I'm like 70 and then I'll go into like Masters 10 or whatever the division is, to the point where like I'll probably have to do it in Costa Rica because it like no one would actually insure that fight. And then like everyone will be so old and out of shape that, you know, actually probably they'll even out.
Yeah. I wonder how long I'll compete for. Hopefully as long as I can.
I know a lot of people who compete well into their later years, but there does seem to be that cutoff point, right? Once people get to around 40, they kind of hang it up. And I think that's just because, I mean, part of it is because it's hard to be competitive past that age. But even if you did want to keep going into the late Masters divisions, I think once you get to that age, there's just other stuff that comes up in your life, which now is a higher priority. And usually at that point, you've started the process of giving back to the next generation. And pretty quickly that becomes where you want to focus your attention, especially because if you're doing it professionally and you run a gym, that's where you're making your money. So it makes sense that that would now become your focus over actually competing. But maybe that's something else that we should touch on, Matt, is the fear of like opening a gym or really opening any kind of business for that matter, to kind of put yourself out there. That's a different level of scary, because not only is there the risk of personal humiliation, there is also now the risk of financial ruin, right? That adds a totally different scare factor, because if you screw that up, I mean, if you have a family, you know, now you're putting them at risk. It might be harder for you to get back on the horse at a different job if the company doesn't work out that you've created. Like, there's a lot of challenges with starting your own business. Now, again, we've talked in the past about calculating return on investment. And I think when people are afraid of taking the first step into something, a big part of that is they haven't really sat down and actually thought through what is the upside and what is the downside. Because if you're going to be honest, if you live in basically any country that has a developed economy, opening a business is generally not very risky, right? The whole economy is structured to incentivize people to do just this. So the upside to you could be a dramatic increase in your personal financial well-being. The downside, I mean, even if your business goes bust, it's actually not really that big a loss at the end of the day. I mean, it might make for a few awkward job interviews in the future if you have to explain it, but it's really not that big a deal. But I think for people who are debating taking that first step into doing a new big business or any kind of initiative like that, I think that maybe they have an incorrect calculation as to how risky it is. And I think they probably think it's worse than it actually is going to be.
Yeah, like starting a business it's scary, but it's also, for me, really motivating. And I kind of look at starting a business as I do driving a car for the first time, or another example would be firing a gun for the first time. I just went to get my PAL, which is like basically a gun license. And, the first time you handle a gun or the first time you step into a car, it's kind of nerve-wracking. It's very foreign. You almost feel like the car controls you or the gun controls you. But if you have that mindset where you're intimidated by the tool itself, then you are going to be intimidated. It's going to affect the decisions you make and how you handle it. Whereas if you take the mindset of, no, I'm just going to take control of this machine, I'm the one who dictates what this machine does, then it's a lot easier to take the stress out of the equation, and you can actually focus on improving and learning. So I sort of think of the same thing as a business, whereas if you want to start a business, but you are intimidated by it and you think that you have that self-doubt, what if I fail, or what, all that stuff. Like, if you listen to that at all, then it doesn't lead to good things. Well, actually, that's not true, because what it actually should do is have the effect of motivation. If you are able to, look at the failure not as an intimidating thing, but just as a reality, and then because of that reality, you are going to be motivated, and that there's no chance you will fail. That is the best attitude, I think, to have a business. And that's the attitude that I had when I started my business, because I knew that if I was worried about things, then I'm just wasting my energy. You can't be wasting energy fearing failure, even though it is a possibility anytime you start something like that. Instead, I just took that fear and I turned it into motivation. Essentially, I refuse to go back cooking. That's sort of what my goal is. In 3 to 5 years, I don't want to cook anymore. I want to be retired from that, and I just want to do jiu-jitsu. And yeah, because I had that mindset, I was able to do something like that. So I think that that's kind of the mindset you should have. And just to add to that, say parenting, for example, I think a lot of young people nowadays are kind of intimidated from being a parent because they're told that kids cost so much, and they can't go party anymore, which is true. And, they can't accomplish things, which is not true. And they're worried that kids hold them back. But what they don't think about is how motivating everything in your life is after you have kids. Because, in a business, for example, it's like, well, if I fuck this up, then my kids aren't going to eat. So it's one of the most motivating things you can do, I think, is have kids. And I think that you can totally be a high-level jiu-jitsu competitor and have kids. You can be a high-level business person and have kids. You can start businesses and all this stuff with something like a child, which is so time-consuming, and it does consume resources, not as much as I think the common narrative says, but it's more of a motivating factor for me than something that holds me back.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I put off having a kid for many, many years. And a big part of that was because, I wanted to make sure that I was totally 100% ready. But I think part of the reason I put it off as long as I did was because, everyone I talked to said, oh, kids are so hard, it's going to be so much work. And it kind of puts fear into you. But, like you said, Matt, I have to say, after having the kid, it's a lot of hard work, but it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be. It's rough sometimes when there's a constant drag on your attention and you never get a moment to yourself, right? It's not always fun. But that said, it was nowhere near as much of a challenge as I thought it was going to be, because people talk about it how, it's going to just completely ruin your life and you'll never be able to do anything again. And that is just not true.
That's
right?
a common narrative that I think I think it prevents a lot of people from wanting to be parents.
Or putting it off, like it certainly did for me, where I put it off for a long time. And it's kind of a silly narrative when you think about it, because I mean, human beings have been around for a long, long time. If having a kid were really that big of a disaster, we probably wouldn't have survived as long as we have. And that's not to say that it's easy, but it is one of those things where, there is no way to truly be ready for it. I mean, yes, there's things you can do to make it easier. If you're financially stable, of course, that's going to make it a lot easier. But at the end of the day, having a kid is one of those things that you just can never truly be ready for. Mm-hmm. And it just comes down to doing it. And I think a lot of these things we've talked about here fall under that same boat. People want an easy answer. They want to be told, if you check all of these boxes, then you will be ready. But for anything that matters, usually the conversation is not that simple. Yeah. Usually you kind of at some point just have to do it. And that's the only way that you can truly become ready. It's it's funny. I've been thinking about the concept of expertise a lot recently, and like what does it mean to actually be an expert at something? And there's a lot of different ways you can define that based on education or experience or whatever. But one thing that is actually interesting is that you can't actually become an expert at something until you've done it. So this creates a weird situation where you want to become an expert, but you can't become an expert until you've actually done something. And so people will not take you seriously. But as soon as you've done it, then the whole world changes and now people take you seriously as an expert, right? Uh-huh. It's an odd thing. It's like how, an example everyone can relate to, if you are just going into the workforce and you never had a job before, then you can definitely relate to this, which is that a lot of people will post these job ads, but they don't want to hire you unless you have any experience, right? They want to hire people who have already done it before. So, your retort to that can be, well, how can I get experience if you won't let me actually do the job? Mm-hmm. And eventually you'll convince someone to let you do it. And then, of course, as soon as you start working and you have experience, suddenly people take you a lot more seriously. And that's just kind of one of the interesting things, which is that there's kind of a narrative that you shouldn't do something because, you're not qualified to do it, or you don't have the experience to do it, or for whatever reason, you'll probably fail if you do this. And if you listen to all of that advice, then you'll never get out of the gate. But what I found interesting is when I encounter that kind of negative feedback, if I push through and actually try it, then within about 10 minutes, people now take me seriously as, as someone who knows what I'm talking about. It's actually kind of funny how so much of just establishing yourself as an authority is just having the balls to actually do something that other people wouldn't do. Yeah, it's so true. And that reminds me of teaching a jiu-jitsu class for the first time, which is super nerve-wracking. I mean, I actually never found teaching adults to be too nerve-wracking, and I think it's because I love teaching things that I'm interested in. However, teaching kids in front of parents is nerve-wracking. And it's not just the teaching, it's the fact that mommy and daddy are sitting there watching and silently judging you the whole time you're doing it. And they're paying you. Right. So it's like you're kind of, they're watching your performance and they're constantly asking themselves, is this worth my financial resources? So like you said, a lot of it is how you just own it and your attitude about it. And like I mentioned, talking about driving or shooting a gun for the first time, it's like you have to take control of the situation. You can't let the situation control you. You have to be the person in control of your own destiny. And that involves confidence, and it involves, honestly, an intimidation factor that is uncomfortable. But again, like you mentioned, becoming an expert at something, you have to do it to become an expert. After you do it enough times, it kind of just becomes another one of those repetitive things, and it becomes habitual, and it's not scary anymore. Just like going to jiu-jitsu class, or I can't say doing competitions isn't scary. It still is, but it's not as scary. I know what to expect. And having another kid, it's like I've had two now. It's like it would be scary to have another one, but it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Thank God I don't have to actually bear children. So that's where I have to give major credit to women, because that's true. I guess it's pretty easy for us to. That is probably the most scary thing I could ever think of. Yeah. So for our female listeners, I fully understand that us talking about how bearing children is not as hard as we thought. I get that obviously the guy doesn't have to do the majority of the work. For a woman, it's even a scarier experience because, of course, you have to actually carry that baby for 9 months.
And then at the end of it, it bursts out of your genitals. So, yeah, it's pretty sweet being a dude. Thank you, ladies, for keeping the human race going. Anyways.
I have no follow-up.
Yeah.
Does that mean we should just end the episode?
I don't know. That's kind of a mic drop. It's like, once you bring up childbirth, like, for me, there's nothing more terrifying than that thought. Like, literally, I don't think there's anything more terrifying than, well, maybe losing your child, but, like, the act of giving birth is, like, pretty fucking crazy. So there's not much you can really add on to that.
Looking back at all of the big moments I've had in my life, having our kid was one of the most frightening. And, you know, I'm the guy in the relationship, so I can only imagine what it would have been like for my wife.
Yeah. She's probably like, wow, I can't believe I mated with this dude who will never do a jiu-jitsu competition.
I hope she doesn't listen to this podcast.
Such a prick.
She's a patron, so she probably actually does listen.
Your wife's a patron?
Yes.
That doesn't count. That's like you signing up.
Well, you know what? So she was the first patron because when we set the whole Patreon up, I needed to have someone who was a patron so that I could test it, right? Like I needed to make sure they were getting the emails and that when I published something, it went up to Patreon, and she just never unsubscribed, which actually is kind of stupid because Patreon takes like a cut out of all of the money that she donates. So it actually would be better if she just paid me the money, but I don't know. It's always nice to have an extra patron. I feel like I've earned that money.
Got to pad the stats, you know?
Yeah.
But I guess this would be a good time to thank our patrons.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you know what? Before we even do that, we can just do a quick recap of this episode.
Cool.
So taking the first step on anything, whether it be going into jiu-jitsu or doing your first competition or opening a business or having a kid or really any major life event, when you do that, it's very easy to psych yourself out of doing it because there's always reasons you can come up with as to why you shouldn't actually do this scary thing. But the reality is that the more you think about these things and the more you get inside your own head, the less likely you're going to be to do these things that you actually need to do to grow and improve as a person. Now, that's not to say that every single thing that you could do is a good idea to do. There are some things that, you know, you're afraid to do for a good reason because they're dumb things to do. But what you need to do with any new initiative is you need to do that return on investment calculation in your head. And once you've made the decision that something is worth doing, at that point, it doesn't make any sense to worry about it anymore. It makes sense to start trying. So that's what we would like you to take home today. So just to recap the mental models we talked about here, we talked about mindfulness, basically the concept of focusing on and being present in the current moment. The problem with the fear of the first step is the more you obsess over what's coming up and how hard something's going to be, the more you psych yourself out of actually doing it. We talked about return on investment. Once you've made a decision that something is a good investment of your time and your resources, then at that point, it doesn't make sense to worry about it anymore. It makes sense to actually go ahead and do it. We talked about investing in a loss and how one of the scariest things of any new first step is the fear of loss, of humiliation. All of these things are scary, and that's understandable, but that's really the ego talking. What you need to do is you need to develop that mindset where you look at loss as a learning opportunity and as an investment in your growth. We talked about defensive thinking, which is the practice of coming up with excuses before you've even done something. And Matt, you gave that great example of people who kind of give themselves permission to lose in a tournament before they've even stepped on the mat. That's really a bad habit to develop because although you can masquerade it as, you know, self-deprecating humor, the reality is you're basically setting up failure before you've even tried. And that's a very self-destructive habit.
It's a good way to lose.
Yeah. And we talked about emotional contagion, which is how the emotions and the mindset that you bring to the table actually have a contagious effect on the people around you. So when you do bring in this kind of like toxic mindset, it's not necessarily just you that you're impacting. You are sending a signal to the people around you as to what kind of behavior is accepted. And if you've ever worked with a really toxic coworker, then you know exactly how damaging this can be. So, Matt, with that said, before we get to the patrons, something I actually wanted to bring up. I don't really have a question today, but I have more of a listener update. We've got this guy named Sean. He's a listener who I've been going back and forth with through email for a while. I think I told you about this. He's in Florida, and of course, he's concerned because of the COVID situation down there. But I got a message from him the other day saying that in a work accident, he actually had lost 2 of his fingers.
Ew, Jesus.
I know. And you know what's interesting is he said that what would really make him feel better is if we gave him a shout out on this podcast. I don't know why that would make him feel better. I don't know why anyone would care, but here you are, Sean. Here's your shout out. Sorry about your fingers.
Jeez, one of my best friends lost a finger. He's a carpenter on a saw. God, that would suck. So sorry about your luck there, Sean. Hopefully they weren't your banging fingers.
You know, I'd be more concerned about whether they're your gripping fingers for like collars and lapels.
Yeah, I'm always, when I think like that, I always think about Machado, how one of his hand has like no fingers on it and he's still awesome. So not the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I mean, I know people who have lost fingers before. It's a very common thing. And what I found interesting is how quickly you seem to be able to just get on with and move past that. Like, I mean, obviously it sucks. You know, it's great to have all of your fingers, but I mean, I would just keep your head up and just keep at it, because I'm pretty sure that you're going to find a few years from now, you know, it won't really be impacting your quality of life as much as maybe it feels like it would right now.
Yeah, you'll get used to it. I have no idea. I have all my fingers, thank God, but I'm assuming you're going to get used to it.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, I have all my fingers and I don't play any type of spider guard or anything anyway. So if I can adapt my game to not have to use those kinds of grips, then I'm sure you can too.
I mean, look on
that
the
was a terrible motivational speech.
I mean, look on the bright side. You can't get arthritis in those fingers anymore.
That is true.
Yeah.
I hope this guy's not a patron.
Please don't stop paying us.
So now we can finally thank the patrons. So again, this train wreck is supported by people on Patreon. If you found this helpful, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/BJJ Mental Models. Again, that's patreon.com/BJJ Mental Models. If you get value out of the podcast, then supporting us on Patreon is the single most helpful thing you can do to help us continue making the show. So thank you again to all of the patrons who support us.
Yeah, I just want to say, guys, I really appreciate the support. And something I've started doing is I'm trying to film more techniques and do video breakdowns of roles and things like that for you guys. So just thinking of new ways that we can give content to you. And if you have any ideas, or maybe you even have competition footage that you would like me to look at, you can always send it in. And we also have the Discord chat where we already are speaking to a bunch of patrons. So would love to offer our services to you guys however we can. Yeah, we've got this Discord chat going. We're really trying to create a two-way conversation with the listeners, and also to create a community of conceptual grapplers, people who want to share their experience and get feedback from each other. So Matt and I have been on there watching people's competition footage and giving them feedback. So if you've got anything that you would like us to review or critique, then that's the place to do it. That's the place to send it to us. Mm-hmm. And yes, thank you so much, you guys. It really motivates us to give you more content, give you the best stuff we can, and again, open for more ideas, whatever you guys need. Absolutely. Yeah. If there's anything that you think particularly would be worthwhile, we're happy to hear it in terms of things that we could create that would help you guys get better, not just at jiu-jitsu, but actually just to kind of all aspects of life. That's sort of the concept of the show. If you want to learn more about what we talk about here on the show, you can go to bjjmentalmodels.com. That website is where you can find our database of mental models and get more context on the concepts we talk about here. You can also go to bjjmentalmodels.com/store, where you can pick up gi patches, t-shirts, and hoodies. You can go to bjjmentalmodels.com/join and get on our mailing list. And you can check us out on Facebook and on Instagram. Matt, you still dying of heat exhaustion over there? So I've literally opened my front door, so anyone who walks by right now is going to see me in my underwear talking about jiu-jitsu. That's funny because I am sitting in my daughter's room, so I am staring at a rocking horse as I'm talking right now. There's also Play-Doh all over the ground. What else is here? There is... Don't you clean up?
No. Like, I mean, like not like blobs of Play-Doh,
Oh.
like her containers of Play-Doh were stacked over in the corner.
Yeah. Does it remind you of her?
You know, I miss her terribly, honestly. I think we mentioned earlier on the show that my wife and kid are out of town, so I'm very lonely. I mean, I've been trying to fill the void with video games, but honestly, there's no substitute.
But you don't seem to miss your wife. Bringer of children and cleaner of cat litter box.
Well, I mean, the thing is, you know, my daughter, she's got certain games that have to be played, right? Like, I don't know if she's getting all of the painting done that she needs to do. You know, we race around the house. I don't know if that's being done right now. You know, we have all of these daddy-daughter activities that I just don't know if they're happening. And, you know, that to me is priority.
That's fair.
Plus, my wife is probably just as happy to have a break from me. So
Yeah.
it is kind of nice to, you know, just kind of like get away and have a moment to yourself. That is one thing about, you know, when you start getting adult responsibilities is it is nice every once in a while to just take a break and go back to just being on your own and not having to worry about anything.
Yep. You got to take it where you can. And definitely when you have kids, you are tied up a lot more. But you find a way, and they enrich your life so much. So I recommend
Absolutely.
it. Have some kids.
You know, I'd love to do an episode on fatherhood or I guess parenthood at some point. That would be a really interesting thing to do because jiu-jitsu is so much about kids. It is a very kid-friendly sport. So something to think about. I would like to do that at some point.
Yeah, for sure. Let's do it.
But you know what I want to do now is I want to go back to the couch. I want to play Last of Us 2 until about 4 a.m. and I want to eat some ice cream.
Wow. Are you going to do that?
Maybe. I'll get back to you.
Sweet.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care, guys.
Take care, guys. Bye.